It is a great honor to welcome David Cortright on this program. He is the Professor Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame. And today we're speaking about his book, Soldiers in Revolt, GI Resistance During the Vietnam War. David, welcome to the show. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, so this has been a very interesting read. I follow along the book as preparation for the show, and it's a wonderful, very revealing history. I should like to first begin by asking you about your time serving in the Vietnam War. What do you remember most about it?
Well, yeah, I was drafted in 1968, right after I got out of college, and I wasn't really very aware of what was going on in the war, but in order to avoid the infantry, I decided to volunteer, and I served as a musician in the Army band.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that was my job in the Army, to defend the country by playing a trumpet and a baritone horn. So I was just basically trying to skate by and get out of the Army unscathed and go on with my life. But the more I learned about what was going on in Vietnam, and as I talked to the soldiers who were coming back from the war, and began to read about what was going on in Vietnam, the more horrified I was to realize that everything that our commanders and the political leaders and the press were saying about the war was wrong, that we were slaughtering, killing so many innocent Vietnamese civilians, just ordinary farmers. And it was, as I say, horrifying. And I felt like I had to speak out against this. It was just so unjust that I couldn't accept business as usual. So I began to speak out against the war, even though I was an active duty soldier. I think of my Army duty as, I had to play in the Army and in the band and play all the parades and things that they make you do. But every free moment that I had, I was talking about the war and trying to organize among fellow soldiers to speak out against the war.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember where you were when you were in Vietnam?
I never got deployed in Vietnam. I was stateside the whole time. So I initially was based at Fort Hamilton, New York, right outside New York City. And then I was transferred to Fort Bliss, Texas. So that was the two major bases where I was stationed during the war.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about some of the findings which you found that changed your view on how the war is progressing.
Well, first of all, was just the utter scale of the devastation. To learn how extensive was the war. The U.S. sent 500,000 troops to Vietnam. That's a huge size army, much bigger, for example, than the Russian army now attacking Ukraine, double the size of that. And then we were unleashing this massive bombardment and killing so many civilians. And it wasn't hard to get that information. It was, the New York Times and other newspapers were starting to publish it. And I remember vividly, I just tried to make sense of all this. So I decided to read a few books about the history of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And I read a book by Bernard Fall, the famous French historian. And he pointed out how the whole premise of the war, that somehow there were two separate Vietnams, was false. Vietnam had its regions, of course, but what was going on in the 1950s through 70s was a war for national liberation and unification against foreign occupation by the French, and then against American intervention. And then I read a biography of Ho Chi Minh,
mm-hmm.
and I was so impressed by him as a character, as an individual who had fought so long and done so much for his country's independence, and a true nationalist. Yeah, he was a communist, but it seemed to me mostly he was a national hero, and I admired him. And it's it's kind of strange, right? You're a soldier in the army that's fighting him and his government and his people, and yet you come to admire the leader of the other side. So that was a strange feeling, but it all just came to me to see that I actually felt that we were on the wrong side of the war. You know, it's shameful that we had supported the French to try to retake their colony after World War II. And then it was even more shameful that we intervened and tried to control and take over Vietnam. You know, we set up the South Vietnamese government, the Republic of South Vietnam, supported it all the way, even though it had very little support within the political context of Vietnam. And so, yeah, all of that just contributed to my thinking that this war was wrong. As I say, we were on the wrong side, and that we should end this war as rapidly as possible. We had no business being there, and we needed to stop the killing.
Yeah. Well, as you can guess from my last name, I'm Vietnamese. I've just to compare notes. It is true that in our historiography, Vietnam has always been a united entity, and it's always strived to be a united entity. And still to this day, there is a nationwide reverence for Ho Chi Minh. I disagree with his communism, but
sure,
that doesn't stop me from acknowledging his contributions to modern Vietnam, of course, amongst other things.
Right.
So have you had a chance to visit my lovely country since?
Yes, I have at a couple of occasions, and most recently in 2018. Yeah, I love your country, and so beautiful. And so I was there in 2018 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the My Lai massacre. And you know the history of that terrible, tragic day in March of 1968, when American troops killed 500 people, civilians, in these villages near Son Mi. So it was a very moving experience, of course, to be there on that moment and to go to that place and walk the pathways where so many people were just gunned down. But while we were there, we visited widely in the country. We were in Hanoi for a while. We went to Da Nang, went to Ho Chi Minh City, traveled around in the countryside and in the cities. And it was a great opportunity to get a sense of how much Vietnam has developed over the decades. It's a completely different place. I visited there right after the war in 1979 on a humanitarian mission. There was a movement called Friend Shipment in the US by anti-war activists who made donations to help Vietnam recover from the war, and especially medicines and pharmaceutical goods and medical equipment. So we went over to deliver that in 1979, as I say, and you know the country was still reeling from the effects of the war. People were extremely poor. There were bomb craters all around, still some destroyed buildings. The roads were terrible. We went up at that time in 1979. We went up to the Chinese border, and it took, I don't know, hours and hours to ride on this road that had been bombed by the Americans, and then it had been damaged at some of the cities close to the border during that war they had with that Vietnam had with China in 1979. So anyway, so then fast forward, I was there almost 50 years later, and to see how much Vietnam has grown, and the big cities, Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi and Da Nang. I was really struck in Da Nang. We drove south along the coast, and that's the area that the American GIs called China Beach. Was where they would go for a break from the battle and go off and be on the beach for a while. And now that area is lined with hotels and resorts, and it has tourists who come from Australia or China or Japan and Europe and North America. It's great. So I really admire the country. It's really developing. I mean, I can see how the communist government is really totally controlling, and that's unfortunate. But in terms of the overall economic and social well-being, it seemed like people have definitely improved, and the country's at peace. And now Vietnam is a friend with the United States. It's wonderful, you know. I kept thinking as I was there in 2018, what a horrendous waste this whole war thing was. Just if we could have just skipped all of that slaughter and the deaths and destruction, and just said to the Vietnamese, you know, hello, we love you, you know, we want to welcome you into the community of nations, and we'll be your friend. You know, we could have skipped all of that, but anyway, I'm glad for Vietnam that it's landed on its feet and doing very well in terms of its national prosperity and its well-being, I think. Yeah. So.
Yeah, much appreciated. I am from Hanoi, so it is a lovely city, but I think my favorite city in Vietnam is Da Nang, just for the beaches.
Yeah.
There are no beaches in Hanoi, unfortunately.
Yes, right. Yeah. Or in Ho Chi Minh City. Yeah. That's
right. Yeah, that too.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I wonder, the Vietnam War officially ended in 1975, although the American extrication of it is 2 years prior with the signing of the Paris Accords, or the Paris Accords. So, how would you reflect on how the war ends?
Well, it ended as many expected that it would, that the North would overpower the Southern government and then just march in and take over the presidential palace in old Saigon. So when it ended, I remember I was in Washington, D.C. at the time. I was a student, and there had been many anti-war protests in Washington. There was a very large anti-war community. And most of us had gone on to try to do other things. We were at school or working in other pursuits. But when the war ended, spontaneously, thousands of people converged on Lafayette Park in front of the White House. And that was the place where people used to go to protest back in the day. And it was a day of sadness and of happiness. And I remember crying, thinking about so many people who had died for nothing, for a lost cause. But then also happiness for the Vietnamese, that finally the war was over. They had won against the Americans. And I guess we still feel that way now, that why did we have to do that? And we're still trying to come to grips with it, I think, in this country. You know, I worked with Tom Hayden and some other anti-war people a few years ago to create Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, we called it. And it was an effort by those of us who had been in the anti-war movement to just bring forward the history of the anti-war movement and to recognize what had gone on and to look at the parts of the history of the Vietnam War that most Americans don't know much about and don't like to think about. So when I reflect upon those 50 years, I think that we in the anti-war movement worked hard to try to end the war. Ultimately, it was political pressure in the US that forced an end to the war, along with, of course, the ferocious resistance of the Vietnamese armed forces. The US could not defeat the Vietnamese. And we killed so many, 1 million, 2 million, who knows how many Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians were killed. Horrific. So the combination of the determined resistance of the people of Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, and then also the fact that in the United States, people more and more spoke out against the war, especially from 1968 forward. And that was when I was in the Army, and that anti-war movement, which swept through American society, also took hold inside the military. and that's what my book is about. And we were at Fort Hamilton, New York, as I mentioned, a base outside the city of New York, not a big one, but mostly an administrative center. But we were opposed to the war, and we spoke out against the war, and we signed petitions, and we went to protest demonstrations. And then we realized that soldiers from other military bases were doing the same. And I would meet soldiers from other bases around the eastern part of the US when I would go to a protest in New York or some other nearby city. And so for me, it was incredibly revealing and gratifying to know that we were not just on our own when we spoke out against the war. We knew that we were part of something very big, that there were soldiers all over the military, in all the branches, not just the Army, but the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Air Force, and wherever there were large numbers of American troops based, including in Germany, in East Asia, like in Japan and Okinawa and the Philippines, there were anti-war service members protesting against the war. So that was something quite unique in American history. I mean, there's always grumbling in the armies during wars. There's always some desertions that happen in bloody wars. But what happened in the US military was beyond anything we had ever experienced in the history of this country. And what I say in the book, through studying it very carefully over several years, and then I've stayed on top of the literature. I continue to study what we know about the Vietnam War. It's quite clear that from around 1970 onward, the US Army in Vietnam no longer functioned effectively as a fighting force. There were still some battles going on, but often the troops were reluctant to fight. Often they would go out and just refuse to fight. There was widespread drug use in the military. There was a racial rebellion, of a very extensive resistance against racism by the African American troops. And then there was this incredible development they call fragging. Frag is a grenade, fragmentation grenades. All armies have them. And in Vietnam, soldiers began to frag, that is to say, attack their officers and sergeants with grenades. There were hundreds of attacks and thousands of threatened attacks that took place. When you think about that, it's so horrible. And then there were many combat refusals, just outright, the troops were ordered to go into a fight, go attack this location, and they said no. So all of that was taking place to show that, and the effect was that the Army really was falling apart from within. It's been said it was the most severe crisis of morale and discipline in the history of the US military. And it was resisting, unwilling to fight. And I think the military commanders and senior officials, when they began to pull out the American troops, they did so in part in order to save the Army from total collapse. So that movement of which I was part, we didn't know it at the time, but upon later study, that movement played a significant role in finally convincing American political leaders that the war had to end, that they had to negotiate a deal. And when you think about it, so the troop withdrawals began in 1969. So this is in the midst of a major war. In 69 was the peak of the savagery of the battle. There were that year more than 15,000 American troops died. Probably hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese troops died from the South Vietnamese Army and the NVA troops. So it was a major war, and the US started to pull out. It was a kind of a unilateral withdrawal. And it wasn't because of military necessity, because certainly they were not winning the war. It was because the US could no longer sustain the war. And politically, Nixon had to try to convince the American public that he had a plan to end the war and he would pull the troops out. So all of that was a way of saying that the political pressures, the social pressures in America were such that they had to end the war. And in that sense, we contributed to the end of the war. Just last thing I'll say about that is, I mean, we took no pride or happiness from what we did when the war ended. We only felt sadness. We wished that we could have ended the war sooner. We always felt frustrated that it took so long for this war to end, and it went on and on. But there were millions and millions of us who spoke out against it, and as I say, many of us who were in the military, and ultimately we exerted enough pressure, but we wish we could have done more to end the war.
Now, you opened the book with a beautiful quote from Breck. To quote, "General, a man is quite expendable. He can fly and he can kill, but he has one defect. He can think." Now, what are some of the signs that make you believe that these acts of, civil disobedience is motivated by moral concerns and not by the usual combination of, self-preservation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the motivation for soldiers who refuse war or speak out, become conscientious objectors. They vary. There are some who are, pure pacifists, shall we say, who really don't believe in war at all and have a well-defined moral or religious objection to war. But frankly, that's a minority, especially about the Army. You're talking about the Army that I served in, the U.S. Army, and I think most armies. They're not drawn from the highly educated elites. They're drawn from working classes, from people in the rural communities who may not have had a chance to study philosophy or religion in college. And so they have maybe a gut sense that this war is wrong. I remember vividly that what really opened my eyes is I was in a coffee shop at Fort Hamilton soon after I got into the Army, and I was confused and not knowing what to think about the war, and I was just trying to figure it out. And these African-American guys were in the coffee shop, and they were just so angry and bitter at the war and kept going on and on how fucked up it was, as they put it. And so they were strongly opposed to the war, but they were not on the basis of any kind of political or, philosophical ideal. It was maybe because of their experience of the racism in the Army or whatever it was, had made them angry and bitter. So the thinking soldier concept that Breck evokes in that interesting poem is right. I was college educated, so I did think it through, and there were a lot of us like that. But there are others who just reacted, very viscerally and physically, and said, "I'm not going to be a part of this, and be damned if I'm going to sacrifice my life for this war that has no meaning." When soldiers go into war, well, look on the Vietnamese side. Hundreds of thousands were killed, and they knew they were going to be killed. They were going up against the massive bombing of the Americans. And maybe some of them resisted. I'm sure some were, or the political commissars got on their case. But most of them, they didn't want to die, of course, but they were fighting for their country. And I think about this today, and when you think about Ukraine, which is invaded by Russia, and they're kind of overwhelmed by the size of the Russian army and how big Russia is, but they keep fighting, and they have some morale problems, true, but they're still fighting because they're defending their homeland. It's a just cause for them. Whatever was the motivation for us in the Vietnam, one thing we could say for sure is that there was no rational purpose. I mean, yeah, initially it was like anti-communism, right? And yeah, we were all anti-communist. You know, communism. None of us want communism. But that wasn't what was going on in Vietnam. We were killing farmers and ordinary people and burning the countryside. And so, yeah, that's a really key question, the motivation. I'm interested these days in what's going on in the Russian army because they have a morale problem more than the Ukrainians, and they have high rates of desertion, and hundreds of thousands of young people fled their military draft, and you know and I think if you look, and I've talked to some of the deserters in the Russian military, and what they all say is, you know, I volunteered, I would defend my country, but this is not just. You know, why are we fighting a country that's not our enemy? And I have relatives in Ukraine. Why am I fighting a country that is really part of us? So I don't know if the Russian army is going to have the same that the American army in Vietnam had, but probably not. But there's something of that same syndrome going on. You know, why fight for an unjust cause? Why get killed for something that has no real purpose or meaning for you? If you're defending your own homeland, your own family, that's a very different thing.
Mhm. Now, I've read like researches of and texts of assessing the Vietnam War, and much of the cause for failure is mostly focused on strategic, like the conventional forces and search and destroy campaigns. They are no match for guerrilla tactics that the North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong has. But you've touched on the fact that it is the cost, whether it is just or unjust, that also plays a key role in whether a war can be successful, at least on the American side. So I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, in the early days, it was very widely accepted that, and we all opposed to communism, absolutely, and that the war in Vietnam was an essential part of to prevent communism from taking over Asia. And some said, well, it'll next it'll be on the California coast and it'll come to America. And that was believable for a while, and people were motivated by that. But the war was an attack against a peasant country, and the scale of the killing just became relentless. And the other thing is, frankly, like you said, there was the strategic choices that the United States made, whatever they weren't working. They could kill a lot of enemy soldiers, NVAs and Viet Cong soldiers, but they weren't able to prevent the NLF from still controlling a large part of the countryside, and the NVA kept coming. You know, they never stopped, and so when you're up against an adversary like that, you begin to have a certain sense of admiration. It's interesting if you look at some of the narratives of American troops that came back from Vietnam. A couple of things. One is they thought their own officers and sergeants were corrupt. They thought the ARVN, the South Vietnamese army, was totally corrupt. But they had a kind of a grudging admiration for the NVA and the Viet Cong troops, you know, because they were so courageous, and they kept on fighting despite the massive amount of bombing that we had inflicted on them. So those kinds of factors of motivation, and also the realization that what this really was about was the destruction of the country of Vietnam and attack of the countryside against the countryside. So yeah, the motivation just went down and down. I remember one guy that was, when I was at Fort Bliss, he was a captain in the infantry. He had volunteered back in '65, and then he re-upped in '67 to go back because he really wanted to be on the front lines of fighting communism, you know. But, you know, after 3 years of this and just seeing the day-to-day realities of the war, he just had this emotional experience. You know, it wasn't religious so much as, you know, he just couldn't go on. He came back, I remember this, to our base, and he kind of got into drugs, but he was saying, I want to write a letter of apology to Madame Bin. Does anybody know her address? He's talking to us in our anti-war group. And first, we thought he was kind of wacko, or he had been doing too many drugs or something. But, you know, it was his way of trying to honestly process these feelings of guilt that he had and the confusion that he had about what the war was, what it was about. And so I just think for us as a country, there was the sense. And then any war, at a certain point, when is it worth all the sacrifice? I guess the Ukrainians are dealing with some of that today, right? When they think about how much they've suffered, they seem to be wanting to continue to fight. But on our end, for the U.S., after all those years, by 1969, we're talking about 35,000, 40,000 American troops killed and hundreds of thousands wounded, and all the money and the sense that it wasn't worth it. Whatever gain might come of the war could not be worth the deaths of so many of our own troops, not to speak of the much larger number of Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian people who are being killed.
Yeah. I'd like to hear you speak on how the war impacted the Vietnamese too. I have some few stories I can share in that. I think every town and every village of Vietnam, and certainly of Hanoi, there lies a cenotaph of commemorating the soldiers who laid down their lives, some of which are unknown. And funny enough, there's a story back when I was still living in Hanoi. I think it was around the year 2015, 2016, about like the resurgence of these psychics and mediums who claimed to be able to locate the soldiers who were dead and who were unknown, and their families, you know, kind of sort of believed them. Many of them like became like household names for a year or two. And there are other stories of when I live in the West, specifically in Europe, where the Vietnamese diaspora there are mostly people from the South, and
Yeah.
they are either refugees or descendants of refugees fleeing Saigon after the fall of the South Vietnamese regime. And I've been told that many of them would not talk to me because I'm from the North, and they view people from the North as enemies. You can tell because of the accents. Southerners have different accents than Northerners. So in some ways, maybe it's different now with the following generations, but for the people who have fought and lived during that time, the war created an irreparable amount of bitterness between people of the North and people of the South.
Yeah, I think that's true. And you can see it in the US, as you mentioned, many Vietnamese in the US, most of them came from the South government, and they fled in the latter years of the war and then afterwards. And they were bitter. They believed in the war. Many of them had been maybe officers in the military or officials in the government. And they came to California and other places, and you know, have made a life for themselves. And I've had 2 or 3 students at Notre Dame, where I was teaching for many years, would come by, you know, an 18-year-old, and she would say, you know, my grandfather was part of the South Vietnamese Army, and my family is all feel that the war was lost, but they wanted to win it, and she wanted to know what it was about, and to try to learn more about all of that history. And as I say, other students have done the same. And I can see that political feeling of just being totally opposed to the North, to the communists, and still admiring the Arvin. It's still a strong feeling. When I was living in South Bend, which is the town near Notre Dame University, right down the street, the next block down from our house, was a guy. I never actually went up to talk to him, but I could see him in the streets, because outside of his house, he put the old Arvin flag, which is you still occasionally see around in the U.S., and also the American flag. So he was like a super supporter of Trump, and a kind of a right-wing patriot. And but he was also, still waving the flag of the government of Saigon. And then I guess you saw during the January 6th insurrection or attack on the Capitol in 2020, one of the flags that some of the extremists were waving was the Arvin flag. So it's become something of a symbol for kind of a right-wing extremists in the U.S., but it's also very strongly felt by a good part of the Vietnamese American community. I'd say probably a majority. And it seems with the younger generations, at least these few students that I had who asked me about it, I don't say that they're passionately anti-communist, for the government of Saigon, but that's clearly the social context of their families. And so they're bringing that to someone like me to just try to find out a little bit more what was really going on there. So I think a lot of maybe like yourself and other younger generation Vietnamese, certainly on the U.S. Vietnamese Americans, are still caught up in that, and some of them may be following their grandparents, or some of them may be trying to find their own way. I don't know. So,
Yes, it is true that those who still hold on to the former Republic of Vietnam's memories is in some ways a version of, I suppose, the lost cause narrative that you have here in the U.S.
Yeah.
They tend to be quite right-wing, Trump supporting Republican types, and
Yeah.
I've heard that I've heard stories about every year in the Australian capital of Canberra, there would be like a pro South Vietnam supporters gathering around in protests on the 30th of April, which is the day where their regime fell. They would gather around the Vietnamese embassy to protest it every year. I'm not sure whether that is true in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I don't know that they're gathering in Washington. I would imagine, though, in some of the Californias and communities in California, they would have ceremonies and programs. Yeah, I'm sure they do. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the racial component in the protests against the war. Of course, Muhammad Ali famously refused to partake in the draft. He says something like, "I would not take up arms against like a fellow colored person," or something like that. So tell me more about how. So were the black draftees more resistant to the war than the white draftees?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, and the famous quote from Muhammad Ali is, no Vietnamese never called me nigger. And I wouldn't use that word otherwise, but that quote's an important one. And yeah, I mean, the African Americans were coming off of an experience throughout the 1960s of racial uprising and of racial organizing against segregation and racism in American society. And then many of them were drafted into the military, or some volunteered, and they encountered similar kinds of racism in the ranks. And it's very few people know about the racial uprisings that occurred in the military in those days. So everyone knows there was a massive rioting in Detroit and Watts and Newark in the American cities from 65 to 68. Well, there was then a whole wave of similar rebellions in the military, at Camp Lejeune, at Fort Bragg, at the Fort Dix Stockade, at the LBJ Stockade in Saigon, in Long Ben and other places in Vietnam. And it was basically their resistance to the deeply rooted racial prejudice that still existed in the military in those days. I mean, the U.S. Armed Forces were the first major government institution that was desegregated. First, it was the civil service for the military and during World War II. And then right after World War II, the military was desegregated. That was at a time when most of the South of the United States was still rigidly, legally segregated. When many of these soldiers came into the military in the 60s, there was a fight against segregation, but it still existed. So there was a really major battle going on inside the military. And yes, many of these Black guys were much more militant than us white troops. They tended to be much more skeptical of the war than we were, most white guys were. But their actions, they were sometimes anti-war, but mostly they were anti-racism. And they were responses to specific racial injustices that some of the troops might have experienced. But it was very widespread, and some of it was politically organized. People don't know or remember very much. There were several chapters of the Black Panther Party inside the military in those days. And other, political groupings formed among the African American troops. So it was a major part of the morale and discipline crisis that the U.S. military faced in those days.
Yes. I wonder if you were ever involved with John Kerry and his group, Vietnam Veterans Against the War.
Yeah, I mean, I met him once, and so I didn't know him very well. And once I got out, I did join Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And I participated in one or two of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War actions, but I was not a major player in the organization. But it was an extremely important group that the Vietnam veterans who had been in combat and then came back and organized this group that had at its peak about 20,000 members. And they protested against the war. And this is starting, by 69, 70, 71, 72. And they brought incredible power and legitimacy to the anti-war movement, authenticity, and a degree of social standing that others could not have. I mean, I was part of that in the sense that I was an active duty soldier, and often the pro-war people would say, "We support the war, we support our troops," and we would say, "Lady, we are the troops. we don't want the war to begin, to continue," and that's what the veterans said. We want to support the troops, pull out of Vietnam. We don't want this war. We've been there. We've seen what's going on, and we know it's unjust and cannot be won. And it's time to end the war. And you probably know the history, but the Vietnam Veterans Against the War organized a big protest in Washington in April of 71. And about 1,000 veterans came to the Capitol. They camped out in the public park areas, and then they marched up to the Capitol, and about 800 of them lined up in front of the Capitol and threw away their military ribbons and their combat decorations, and made short statements about why they hate the war and how it needs to end. That whole action by the Vietnam veterans was extremely influential in public opinion. We know that the Nixon White House was just worried about it. They closely observed everything that was going on. They tried to undermine what the veterans were saying. At one point, Nixon said, well, these are not real veterans, you know. But then the veterans had anticipated this, and they all had brought with them their service records. And when you get out, you get this DD 214, this form we all have been in the military. So they all had them, and they showed them. And they had their actual combat ribbons. Some of them were, you know, in wheelchairs or, you know, walking with canes and had severely injured. So they had authenticity that no one could deny. And you could really see that it had a powerful impact on public opinion. And indeed, the opinion polls were already shifting against the war well before this time. But there was a more decisive shift against the war, in part because of the role of the Vietnam veterans.
Yes. Yeah, the image of the veteran in the wheelchair reminds me a lot of Ron Kovic, that guy who was made famous in that movie and the book Born on the 4th of July.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So speaking of Nixon, so I think this is my first time mentioning him in the podcast ever since he died. But how would you assess Henry Kissinger's role in the war?
Well, we always thought of him as a war criminal. I mean, he was one who engineered a lot of the war, the secret bombing, so-called secret bombing of Cambodia, which they hid from Congress. They broke the law to hide it from the U.S. Congress. And yeah, he was acting on the orders of Nixon, who wanted to increase the bombing. You know about the strategy. As they pulled out the ground troops, they intensified the bombing, which was already among the most intensive bombing campaigns in the history of warfare, and bombed even more. And then they started bombing in Cambodia because the government of Cambodia under Sihanouk had a policy of neutrality. They weren't going to try to work against Hanoi and the NVA. On the other hand, they were not necessarily in favor of the war, and they didn't participate. So they just let their territory be used as a transit point and kind of a safe haven from the war for the Vietnamese. So the U.S. started attacking them, and that destabilized the regime. Then Sihanouk was overthrown by the military, and then the Khmer Rouge, which was, you know, a left-wing communist force without a whole lot of support initially, suddenly grew up to be a major force and took over the whole country. And all of that was Kissinger's policy, that bombing Hanoi. And so all of that, you know, he was the architect and chief engineer, operator of one of the most criminal wars in U.S. history. On the other hand, at the very end, he became the one to negotiate the end of the war. You know, the history of the diplomacy is complicated, but at the end, the U.S. had to make concessions, and it did. The NVA made concessions. The Saigon regime would not, for a while. President Tu would not accept the presence of the NVA troops in the northern part of Vietnam and Quang Tri in that region. But eventually, he was forced to it. The U.S. just signed the agreement. The South Vietnamese government never really accepted it. But, you know, Nixon and Kissinger at least had the good sense to see that the war had to end finally, and that the negotiations, which had started in 69, well, even late 68, but more formally in 69, finally that the negotiations produced an agreement. So
now, first, you mentioned what happened in January the 6th, 2021. And I certainly
Yeah,
believe
I
that.
I had the date wrong there. I said 2020, 2021. You're right. Yeah.
So that made me think about like how what happened in Vietnam eroded public trust in the major institutions of American public life, the government, the military, etc.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
to what extent should these institutions be given trust, and to what extent should they not?
Well, you're right about how Vietnam really changed the whole concept and culture around trusting government. Dan Ellsberg, the famous whistleblower who released the Pentagon Papers, um, said that before Vietnam, Americans trusted their government. Afterwards, they could never trust it again. And that's probably a little exaggerated, but yeah, I think it's always good to be skeptical of government, and but I think there's too much. It's too easy to just say every government agency is corrupt. I mean, yes, some of them are, and government has many limitations, but ultimately we need, proper governance for society to run, and uh, and political cynicism is understandable and legitimate, but politics is not about purity. It's about lesser of evils often. Which of two or more imperfect candidates is going to be the one to try to address the needs of society the best. And I think we've really lost the sense of a broader social purpose of thinking about the whole society, not just me and my particular group or interest. So, yeah, I think the war has that continuing effect. It created a legacy of distrust and a sense of the utter corruption of government, and we feel that still today. So,
Do you feel that it has divided American society in ways that it's hard to repair?
well, it's not just the war. Many things have done that. The Iraq War came along, and many other crises we've faced. I do think I need to. By the way, I need to get off here because I'm being called by a number of people here. So, but no, I think we can still come together and need to in order to address our problems.
Okay, I think that should be a good note to end on. Thank you very much, David.
Okay, thank you. All right, best wishes. Sorry, bye.